Well, welcome everyone. I'm so happy you're here joining us today. Dr. Alvarez and I were talking about funds of knowledge right when we were starting the webinar and our shared love of the framework. And then I realized, oh, we need to start. So here we are. Welcome back to a new year. This is our January session of Hispanic Serving Institution webinar series centering servingness. I'm Judy Marquez Quillama, Associate Vice Provost for Faculty Development here at the University of Arizona. And I know that we have folks joining us from across the country. I recognize a few names who have been in some of these webinars before. Thank you for coming back for these conversations. On behalf of Faculty Affairs and HSI initiatives, we welcome you to the U of A and we welcome you to this webinar today. I want to begin by recognizing and paying honor to the original inhabitants of the land on which the University of Arizona resides. This region includes the ancestral homelands of the Tohono O'odham Nation and the Pascua Yaqui tribe. And today's session is particularly relevant as Dr. Alvarez will challenge us to think about and grapple with the role of land grant institutions in the displacement of Native American communities over time. So we offer gratitude in being able to share knowledge on these indigenous lands. Informed by Gina Garcia's extensive body of work on the concept of servingness, this webinar series features faculty and staff who engage in scholarship and servingness efforts that honor the cultures and lived experiences of Latinx, Black, Indigenous, and underrepresented students and communities. And our goal for the series is threefold. We spotlight current scholarship. We offer examples of the rich ways in which servingness is enacted by faculty and staff across the institution. And again, as we were talking before you all joined, many of these folks have been engaged in this work for years and in many cases decades. And it's just so wonderful to have them with us. We invite others both on campus and nationally to learn about and engage in these efforts. And we build knowledge. We build knowledge together. Each month we address the question, what next steps are needed to build institutional capacity around HSI servingness? The U of A received its HSI designation in April of 2018 and has been recognized by both Excelencia in Education and the Hispanic Association of Colleges and Universities for leadership and commitment to Latinx and Hispanic student success. And now it's my honor to introduce you to Dr. Maribel Alvarez, who is representative of many of the individuals who have been consistently engaged in these intentional servingness efforts. I'm especially eager to hear from her as I structure my own scholarship and teaching around the principles of community-based research and funds of knowledge. I often share that community is my guide in this work, yet that I know that I also have so much to learn when it comes to building trust beyond campus boundaries. Dr. Alvarez is an anthropologist, folklorist, writer, curator. She holds the Jim Griffith Chair in Public Folklore at the Southwest Center and is an associate research professor in the School of Anthropology. Since the fall of 2018, she has served as the Associate Dean for Community Engagement in the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. Dr. Alvarez is the founder and until recently served as the Executive Director of Southwest Folklore Alliance, or SFA, an independent nonprofit affiliated with the University of Arizona. SFA is the designated folk arts partner in Arizona for the National Endowment for the Arts. SFA produces the annual Tucson Meet Yourself Folklife Festival, in addition to multiple programs connecting artisanal economies, foodways, ethnographic documentation, neighborhood-based economic development through the US-Mexico border region. So you'll get to hear from Dr. Alvarez for about the next half an hour or so, at which point we'll open it up for questions. I'll monitor the Q&A and the chat, and what I'll try to do as you pose questions is to let you know when I'm going to unmic or unmute you so that if you'd like to answer or ask your question directly, you have a chance to do so. If not, I'm happy to read it for you. So please help me please join me in welcoming our guest today, Dr. Maribel Alvarez.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Judy. And I'm excited to join all of you in this wonderful fellowship that has allowed us to hear from some of our colleagues. I have participated in some of the previous seminars, listening to folks that I truly admire here on campus. Let me see if I can share my screen here so that I can, can everybody see that? Wonderful. So I don't have a lot of slides. It's not a super formal PowerPoint, but it is just some pointers on some things to talk about today. Um, I wonder for let's see. I'm trying to. I wonder how many of you can relate to this quote. Um, Whatever you are connected into your institution at staff level or administrative level, a faculty, student. Um, this is a sentiment that is not strange for many of us for a number of reasons. We spend a lot of time doing work that really matters to us outside of the university, but we derive our livelihood, our paycheck from the university. So we live in these worlds of ambivalence, sometimes contradictions about what is it that where are we situated and what is it about a university in a particular context of the institutional assets and environment of an academic institution that allows to still be who we are. And for some of us, this has been a long time or lifetime question. When I wrote my essay for application to graduate school, I referred to myself in the first line as an impromptu anthropologist, um, reflecting on the fact that I had not really had a lot of training in anthropology, even though I was going to pursue a advanced degree in anthropology, but claiming what for some of us has been a heartfelt reality, and that is that because of our positions, our status as immigrants, as working class people, as community folks who have understood the trajectory of our own families in the larger American experience, because of our histories, sometimes because of our identity elements, whether we are queer people um, or mixed race folks, or for all of those reasons, I had felt that I had to become someone who had engaged in the study of my own life conditions. And that's what I refer to myself as the impromptu anthropologist. And here you can see a photo of one of my favorite photos of one of the greatest ethnographic experiences in my professional life, working with Indian basket makers in the state of Maine, Wabanaki people. And and I think that experience of being ambivalent about using the tools of social science research to understand my own realities, applying a lens of analysis about social and political forces to the things that had impacted me and my family, and being out doing all of that outside of the institution, um, and then wanting to enter the halls of academia to receive a degree, to be able to work within the boundaries of education at a higher learning institution. All of those things were sources of both joy for me in my life. Since I was a little girl, I always dream and used to play with my dolls as pretending I was in front of a classroom teaching them. All of this was a source of joy and pride for me and my parents, my brother and sister. But it also wasn't a sense of disconnection, of disassociation. Do I belong? Is this a place where I will have the skills to be able to succeed and so forth? So um, I think that I'm speaking, and I hope that I'm speaking about experiences that all of us have had. But then at the same time, the university was the perfect place for that kind of sensibility as a Latina immigrant, foreign-born daughter of a working class, a plumber, a small business owner, contractor, and a store clerk, which were my parents. And it made sense for several reasons, because the university is a place where you have debates about public ideas, because you can see the transformative power of someone's life being changed by by encountering new knowledge and new ideas. Because it was at the university where I experienced the greatest and most exciting encounters of experiences across the range of popular culture, intellectual rigor, because the university is a thriving hub of diversity. There were people that I would have never met or understood anything about their religion or their political ideology or their nationality had it not been for being immersed in the diversity of a university campus as a student. And of course, learning about conflict and justice, history, and how we encounter all of those things in our human condition. And finally, the fact that in the university, knowledge is produced that does good things for humanity, whether it is the cure of cancer or the understanding of bacteria or the actual information about how to talk to another person and make sense of what they're saying, even when they're talking about something that you know nothing about. All of these things were the world in which the university felt like home, with some trepidation. And I think one of the things that has happened is that those worlds, that private world of my life as an individual, and the struggles that shape that experience, and that world of the academic world, uh, over over the last 30, 40 years have begun to come together in a way that has challenged us to understand what I call the arc of truth telling and trust building in a very different way. And there has been quite an evolution of this idea. When you think about community engagement and universities engaged in actions that impact, and impact is sort of a thread through all of this, the places in which they exist, the first paradigm that we understand comes from the literature, from the speeches, from the founding of universities, is one of benevolence. And we now know that that benevolence was also very much tied to strategies of wealth transfer, the transfer of wealth that went from actual community assets to university assets. And these were intentionally done. There's now, and not only are we advancing now to the degree of land acknowledgement, like Judy demonstrated at the beginning of this talk, but now we also understand a whole set of notions about land grabs, for example, how unceded lands that were used for the founding of some of land grant institutions and other private and public, to the degree that wealth transference between community assets and universities began. And in the context of that founding, benevolence, being benevolent was the larger university mandate. And by benevolence, I mean that very basic, I call it a low bar idea of doing good for the world. I think we have changed that idea now from just doing good to something a little bit more challenging, which is doing no harm. And I think a harm analysis of the practices of universities have begun to challenge that foundational myth of benevolence. Um, and when I say myth, I mean the good, the bad, and the ugly. And you'll see that as a theme throughout the presentation. There were things that people wanted to do that were possibly really good things, but they were done on top of structures and social systems that were very, very complicated and harmful. And then as we move into the earlier 20th century and almost all of 20th century, you begin to see the specialization, the university retreating from communities, because this is the era of the expert. This is when all the disciplines get entrenched in expertise of their different subject matters. And the paradigm shift from benevolence to outreach. And what is really interesting is that in the outreach category, in a lot of ways, the university was still dictating the terms of engagement. Outreach in a lot of ways meant we need you. In the era of expertise and building the academic disciplines, sociology, economics, anthropology, education, the universities saw itself as the expert, and the community is the source, the subject where we go and mine knowledge. So you see this is in the era of surveys and major analytical projects of even the concept of social class that we use today. uh, Upper class, middle class, lower class, working class, all of these were labels and terminologies that come out of this sort of 20th century mentality of outreach. We are the ones who will create the categories, we do the research, but we need you to be the subject. And then as we enter the 21st century, we have begun to see a change towards the era of engagement. And now there's even something called attached to engagement called impact that comes in and out. But of course, the question always becomes impact for whom and on whose standards. Um, I had a student in one of the classes where I was teaching a few years ago, a participatory action research project in South Tucson. And one of the young women in my class had been assigned to go do a number of oral histories in South Tucson. And she came back to the class, she was crying. I said, "Oh my God, what happened?" And she said, "I went into this store. The owner was there. And when I entered to say, I'm from Professor Alvarez class, and mind that this was a participatory research project that I had received an invitation from the community to go do it. So let's already accept that that box had been checked. Um, when she entered the space, the owner of the shop told her, "Not yet another University of Arizona student asking questions. Please go away. Don't care for your service. I don't care for your community project." And I had to then adjust my curriculum to really explain to the students that this is one of the things that happens when we don't understand this arc of truth telling and trust building, is that we assume we're the first ones to show up. And in fact, there's a lot of people who showed up before us, and not always their results were not always good. And when we talk about modalities of engagement, you can see that there's a lot of things that we call engagement that are thrown together. Sometimes it's pedagogical. There's a lot of amazing work in literature and really rich body and service learning. Our own university here in Arizona has spent quite a bit of work and effort and actually evaluation on student engagement and formalizing that. But sometimes engagement also means civic affairs, being a good neighbor. Being a good neighbor could mean a number of things. Could mean on the service category, faculty members and staff who serve on nonprofit boards, who go give a talk to the school, who do in-service for teachers, all of these good neighbors practices. But sometimes, as I was discussing with some friends and colleagues from the Drachman Institute in the College of Architecture, sometimes we don't think about the way in which the university footprint, for example, impacts the way in the zoning around the university, the cost of housing around the university, the way in which the university's own presence physically can have an impact in among its neighbors. Sometimes engagement means industry relationships, employers, partnering for additional wealth generating enterprises. Sometimes it's part of the mission and the commitment. Here, certainly in most universities and in ours as well, faculty, for example, are asked to do some teaching, to do research, and to do service. And that is all thrown to the interpretation of what service means. Many times service means service to the institution, which is important. We have to serve on committees. We have to be part of task forces. We have to write letters of support for students. Sometimes service, in terms of what that means for the community, is very difficult to ascertain. What what does my service on behalf of the community means, not from my point of view, from the community. Last year, um, before COVID impacted us here at SBS with the Bureau of Applied Research in Anthropology, we commissioned the first study here at the U of A on the impact or the perceptions of impact of university engagement from the community perspective. And when we went to look at the literature, we found out that 90% of the literature on university community relationships is done from the perspective of what the university benefit from the service, from the engagement with community. So you have a lot of literature about how it helped faculty, how it helped the students. A lot of service learning is in there, but there's almost very few studies that have ever been done as to how is the community perceiving the initiatives that were initiated by the university. And of course, we know that in relationship with Native American tribal entities, all of these issues have come to a head in many ways by a simple definition that I call the "don't call me, I'll call you" statement, meaning when we need you, when we need a social scientist, we'll come and get you for this particular project. Other than that, we really are not interested in entertaining proposals across. And it becomes a very interesting dynamic of how do you negotiate reciprocity when the relationship is sort of laden into these dynamics of power. And sometimes of putting brakes to where the university should go based on where it has been. And of course, their research and dissemination. Now we have with COVID a good example of the role that the university can play. And then in more recent times, real advocacy and social change, movement building, the fact that actually a lot of activism for racial justice, a lot of the frameworks for analysis for economic injustice are part and have emerged out of university context. Now, I want to take the time to make sure that I share some interesting history about why for us Latinos, Latinx, Hispanics, the experience of the academy in terms of that ambivalence I was describing before has been the good, the bad, and the ugly. And the first example that comes to mind is the extensive degree through which academia for a long time was predicated on subtext and stereotypes about Latinos and how that defined entire generations and decades of work. I love the essay by Americo Paredes, the great folklorist of this borderlands, entitled "An Ethnographic Work Among Minority Groups." A very long essay with incredible stories and anecdotes. And in the essay, he begins by saying how distorted were the views that was influencing research among about Chicanos, specifically Mexican Americans, how preconceived assumptions were influencing the data, producing studies that resulted in flat caricatures that didn't get the meaning. A lot of the times, you will not be surprised to hear this, it was they didn't get the humor. They didn't, the communities, our communities were considered so flat and so simple that people deny Latinos, for example, the power of irony, of sarcasm, of parody in actually interacting with some of these academic projects. Sometimes the problem of translation. One of the best and most fun examples, and I want to share today, drawn from Americo Paredes' body of work, is when he shows us how this researcher, Monroe Edmondson, draws the conclusion, was a conclusion that existed for a long time in the literature, about the fatalistic Mexican, how the Mexican was not industrious, had no aspirations, and would always accept their lot in life. This sort of race of people who were sort of bound to live in poverty forever. All of these things, the stereotypes, these demeaning views were supported by social science research. And one of the examples that Monroe Edmondson uses in his analysis to reach this conclusion was the translation he made of these copla that is very familiar to many of us. Uh, Guadalajara on a plane, Mexico on a lake. I have to eat this tuna, even if it pricks me, is the translation that Edmondson made. And based on this translation, he actually said, here you have it. The fatalistic bent of the Mexican personality, accepting the fate that she must endure this pain no matter what. Of course, we now know, and those of you are already probably laughing, because this is a really bad translation of this copla. Guadalajara en un llano, México en una laguna, me he de comer esa tuna, aunque me espine la mano. And of course, Paredes says, absolutely absurd. When you read the Spanish formation of the words me he de comer esa tuna, we know that that is not fatalistic at all. It's actually a statement of determination, of bravado. It's a statement of persistence. It's also a humorous statement because, of course, the verse doesn't refer really to a prickly pear. It actually is standing for the seduction of a woman. So it's ironic. It's a metaphor, and all of this is denied by this researcher. And Paredes uses this example to illustrate how the complicit intent of the subtext of the academy damaged and did perpetuating these ideas about students, about Mexican students, Mexicans in the Southwest, and all of these things. Well, this is true that we have had this legacy of incredible bloopers, if you will, on the academic record, on things that were just simply got that wrong. Look, that's not at all what this Mexican verse copla represents. We also have the benefit of saying that we have, and we can take pride of this here at the University of Arizona, we have also contributed research that comes from our community that has completely changed the direction of research. And this is the result, of course, of civil rights movement, bringing lots of Latino academics with PhDs and researchers. And in other words, like the Native American communities have said, the natives talking back to this sort of flat-footed interpretations of Latinos. And in the Funds of Knowledge project, which was originated by Vélez Ibáñez here at U of A, Greenberg, and then taken up by Norma Gonzalez, Raúl Moll, Amanti, all of this incredible work carried on today in beautiful ways by Julio Camarota, all of this incredible contribution that we have made to understanding how to look at our communities from a very different lens, from the lens of assets, from knowing that we're not empty vessels, that we come full of backgrounds of knowledge, accumulated experiences, capital, social capital, cultural capital, all of which translates into assets that are contributions to the institution, to education. And really, we have seen the evolution going back to that arc of from assessments of deficit. And this, when Paredes was writing, he was writing about these anthropologists and these social scientists who were as recently as the 1980s were sort of challenging these ideas. And then you see now today an emphasis like in Julio Camarota's work about liberation, not just establishing a baseline of asset deficit distinction, but really furthering that into actions that really will help our communities in different ways. All of this is happening by Latino academics, changing the discourse of engagement within the institution. Now, before I break so that we can have a conversation, I love to hear what you think about this. we always go back to the notion of how can we do better? How do we not get complacent on thinking, well, here we are, I have my degrees, now we have a lot of faculty who are doing this work. We have programs like the early academic outreach. We are doing all these things. And this quote by Lila Watson, who you may know as an activist from the Aboriginal people in Australia, summarizes a lot of what communities have come to take a stance against engagement in a way. And it seems ironic to us, perhaps, because again, in the benevolence mentality, we mean to do good. How is it possible that our practices and our intentions to do good could be translated or read in a way that do harm? So the work of liberation in engagement now challenges us to undo harms that have been done. And Lila Watson says what I think many people in our community understand, and many of our faculty understand, who do real incredible work in participatory action research, including Andrea Romero, who's sort of been a leader in that field, and uh, many others, Carol Brochin in education. There's so many of us, I can just go on. If I keep naming folks, I'm going to miss two or three people that I should have named, so I shouldn't even started. But Lila Watson says, if you have come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And I think that's the message that we're getting back from communities. One of the ways in which, in my own practice, I always try to help people, this is manifested, is in budgets. The budget tells the story as much as the fancy words in the grant proposal. How are we sharing the resources with communities when we invite them to participate? How are they able to learn? What are the questions along with us as we go along? And those models that put the university in this authoritarian position can be very painful when things don't go well, when we encounter problems in communities, and then it comes back to say, well, we always knew that you would be acting and behaving this way, even if we didn't intend to. So when I think of going forward and doing better, and it's been hard, it's hard to do it, even though I have a job that calls me Associate Dean for Community Engagement, to do these things institutionally is very difficult. And most of the work in the university, and we started a research data exploration last year. I was just reviewing that draft that haven't published yet because the data, we need to do a little bit of tweaking there. But we found that a lot of the majority of the efforts that are being taken on in real consequential community changing dynamics of engagement are being taken on by faculty in their own terms. These are things that people do in their extra time, or staff members who are active in movement, in service professions without a lot of institutional support. So what do we need to do? Well, let me just throw this out here and then we can talk about it. I think we need to be more intentional here at the U of A about how we are committed to doing this work in engagement along the axis of understanding the critical development. There are universities, even ASU, Brown, Duke, have centers where the study of community practice and engagement is evaluated, is completely woven into the same resources that we provide for other source of instruction and engagement and research, and elevated at that level. So intentionality, visibility. A lot of people, for example, when we were talking about funds of knowledge, I was telling Judy, the fact that our own people, our own community scholars, our own public intellectuals here at the U of A developed the funds of knowledge paradigm that has influenced the field of how we think of education in now worldwide. And it's as consequential to me as an important, it should be as visible in the U of A narrative as the fact that we developed a vehicle that could actually travel on the surface of the planet Mars. In terms of the impact of that accomplishment theoretical, conceptual, we don't have quite the same visibility for that type of resource. We don't have the resources well. We don't have the investments that actually make engagement in this sort of critical lens. We also need to be more intersectional. I think there's a lot of discourses, and I don't use this word in the sort of flippant conventional ways in which now everybody says intersectional. I mean, connecting some of these practices of community talkback, of community input, of these harm narratives to actual frames of reference in the U of A that helps us to think about it. One of the ones that I'm passionate about and have been beating the drum and trying to do some work around it has been the restorative justice framework. How do we consider that because universities have been involved in harm creation and wealth accumulation on the back of communities, how could we then reestablish a university ethic that is intersectional in the context of restorative justice, of how we interact with our own communities? And then consequential. What are the ways in which some of the actions that we take? I think COVID has given the university a real opportunity to test that the fact that actions that we take here have an impact in the community that is beyond the boundaries of the campus. We learned that in a very hard way at the beginning of COVID. Now we are in the development of vaccines and testing and providing assets of our university, opening up the doors. We do have spaces, we do have resources that influence the way in which we can serve the community. All of these things have been thrown into consideration. And finally, the last point is how to become, through all of that, when we invoke the word of engagement, a learning community. And I finish with this point because I will tell you that for every amazing, wonderful moment of affirmation that I have experienced in terms of the community seeing us, seeing our good heart, seeing that we have come to be partners in our, whether it's in a public health initiative or whether it is in agricultural practices or whether it is community development, the school garden program that we have here at SPS, all of these things, whenever I have experienced for each one of those amazing moments of connections, of saying, oh my God, this is what we live for, this is why we get up in the morning. There's also been moments of not so good experiences, things that really challenge us to think, how could we have done this differently? What went wrong in the way that we interpreted each other's intentions? And institutionally, we have very little space or places where we are being a repository of this learning. A lot of the things that we see visibility are the things that are always working fantastically. But the fact is that in community engagement, it's a trial and error sometimes. Sometimes it's about learning humility with the community and to collect all of these things into papers, into brief, into a sort of a center that could actually somehow provide this sort of greater texture to the concept of engagement is not something that right now we have in front of us. So I'm going to end my my PowerPoint there, hoping that Judy can come back and help us have a conversation.
Yes, this was so wonderful. Thank you so much. I mean, I knew that you had so much to contribute, but I understand now why so many people kept telling me, you need to invite Dr. Alvarez, you need to talk to her. There's so much that connects with your work. And I hope at some point I can invite you to coffee just so I can have time to keep talking with you. But we have quite a few questions that are popping up. What I'm going to do is unmute you folks so that, and I'll invite you to ask your question. Marla, I think that you had a first question and I will go ahead and unmute you now.
All right, I think you can hear me, correct?
Yes.
Okay, good. It's great, Maribel, to have you here. It's so excited that you were able to join us in this webinar series. But my question for you is, I know that we are just, 24 hours into the new administration of our nation. But I'm curious to get your thoughts in light of the new administration's priority on racial equity. What do you see as higher education's opportunity to be part of or influence liberation, as opposed to just showing up to help?
Wow. Listen, I think we have an incredible opportunity um, to insist, as President Biden said yesterday, on being straight with one another, on speaking the truth. I think that truth became a terrible setback, received a real black eye. And now we have an opportunity to train, to contribute to community dialogue and practices. It's difficult. All of these things that I'm saying are not Pollyannish things about, oh, let's just learn how to talk. We need to invest more in the technologies of dialogue. I think that when we talk about the perception of the university as a place of elitism, we need to challenge that as a place where liberals with elite ideas, who get the nice paychecks and don't know anything about the rest of us, and we all have health insurance, and then all of these divides, I think, are important things that we can contribute. It's going to have to be intentional, Marla. I think it's going to have to take courage. It's going to have to take a certain determination that we will uphold certain levels of dignity above all. I think that when we begin to commit to that kind of work, it begins to show up in many places. For example, a lot of the controversies about a campus speech versus hate speech, the fact that we have instruments that are limited in our ability to then refute that every time that somebody's inciting hate, we are canceling them because there's a liberal cancel culture. All of these things, no one better than us is prepared to provide nuance, complexity, historical facts, and understanding. So the work is huge, and universities are the place where we can do it. But I would say that we cannot just use it as platitudes. This has to be an investment in the technologies of conversation, for example. When we talk about dialogue, we can't just say, well, we should all dialogue. How do we do that? How do we get to talk to people who absolutely believe in conspiracy theories? And how do we even break through that? And so I think that's a way of thinking, of answering your question by saying none better than us, and yet it's going to take a lot of reframing of what our mission is in order to get there.
Thank you. Beth Michnick, I think you also have a question. I've gone ahead and unmuted you.
Great, thank you very much. Maribel, that was really fascinating, and I enjoyed listening to your talk. And I have a question about servingness and your point of view about community input. And I think because you're Associate Dean in SBS for Community, that you may have come into some of these or come up against some of these issues. So in the servingness framework, there's structures for serving, so lots of structures within the university. There's the external influences on serving. Community leaders are some of those. Academic outcomes, non-academic outcomes. So from your perspective, what does community input look like to help shape those structures or reshape them to be serving us?
Well, that's a great question. One of the reasons that motivated me to enter with Diane Austin and the Bureau of Applied Research in asking that question, precisely because we have very little baseline data on what that means from the community point of view. And when I say the community, I already betray the fact that we're talking about communities, many different sectors within the community. It's very clear that there are sectors of Tucson who are very skilled at knowing how to interface with the institution. Business leaders, folks who do that through a number of established mechanisms of consultation. And it is pretty clear that the notion of the community as the source, the base source for data mining, continues to be an issue that has to be discussed. And to what end? Because I think when we're talking about COVID impact, or we're talking economic inequality, racial disparity, racial conflict, civic discourse, all of these things begin usually with a definition that is already prescribed inside the institution. Very few times and this is also, a lot of it is regulated by the funding mechanisms. You never have the time to do all the work of preliminary trust building that it takes to then develop a grant proposal, where by the time you get to the grant proposal, boy, you already almost did the work because you did it. And we see a lot of the best examples are faculty members. I have seen this, who already did all the work and they did it on their own time. And they did it because they wanted to. And then they're ready for a grant proposal that will fund the graduate students, the data collection, the analysis, the writing. But all that trust building is hardly ever funded as a prerequisite of getting to where we need to be. And I think that is a challenge. I think that they would be wonderful if the institution, for example, could establish funding mechanisms to allow people that time frame, the larger frame. I don't think I have to tell you, Beth, I think you know it very well, how many times by the time a proposal comes to the dean's office, for example, a lot of the preliminary work has not been done, right? So you end up saying, like, but to serve whom? How do you know that people want that? How do we even know that you have the community relationship for that kind of topic? And that, I think, is because the funding mechanisms don't allow for the larger temporal frame that is required for trust building. And that's a real problem.
Great, thank you very much for bringing that up.
Thank you so much, Beth, for that question. And I was jotting down notes too about how we can think through possibilities for funding mechanisms or seed opportunities, seed grants that would help faculty move to that place and honor the trust building work and the time, as you mentioned, that goes into it. Ryan, I'm going to unmute you next. Ryan Satterwhite, it's so good to see you on here. I think it's been many years since I've seen you in person.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks. So I'm calling from or participating from UNLV, sister institution in the desert. And I just thank you so much for this presentation. I'm interested in your thoughts on how this work can be expanded. I heard a lot about the work of faculty members being, primary here, which makes a lot of sense. But how does this be expanded in the institution, first and foremost with students, but also speaking as a student affairs professional with student affairs professionals who I think, in my experience, are very much already also engaged in the work of liberation and critical engagement too. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Wow, that's a really important point, and I think I need in the future, when I make this presentation, be aware of that when we talk about engagement in the university, a lot of work it's done by faculty, but a lot of work is done by also professionals and staff who are leading institutions, who are serving in their churches, in their barrios, in their neighborhood associations, who are serving on commissions and boards of of government. I think that there's very little that, from the point of view of engagement, has been done for students and staff in the university. I think it's mostly been under the framework and the rubric of service and faculty. And one of the interesting points is that for a long time, at least in some contexts, not by unfunded labor. Of course, we know that that's not recognized in the VITAs, but faculty also derive certain benefits from some of those engagements, benefits for their own career, for their own VITAs, so that the community began to get a hold of that sense, where in the case of faculty, of staff and students, sometimes that work really goes into the ethers. That is work that you do as a hobby, as a community volunteer, with very little return back to your promotion or to your academic credentials. In the case of students, one of the things we've also seen, and I'm really glad you brought this, is we did a lot of work we have talked a lot about doing things to help the students inside the campus. When there's conflicts, we come and intervene when one group of students is mad at the other, when a speaker is sort of barred from campus, when there's an incident of hate speech. But there's very little investment in civic engagement outside for movement building. And what I mean, I know that movement building may be way far more radical than the language that is wanted to use for these type of things. But I am talking as basic sometimes, and we have seen and had this conversation with students in SBS about civics academies of social change. You know, how do you create a policy change, for example? How do you actually create a movement that unites all three universities and organize them around a student particular issue that you want to advocate and change? And that policy may direct to the Board of Regents, or it may go to the legislature. A student activism itself is not something that we should be shy from supporting in the framework of dialogue, of civic participation, of community building. And sometimes we are very scared of doing that, or because of accused of polarization or partisanship. And I think that is a missed opportunity, because a lot of students are coming to us with a desire to change, with a passion, but not a lot of understanding sometimes of how you actually draft a piece of legislation and begin to organize at all the different levels in which that legislation could change. So I think that there are some opportunities there. All of the things that I'm sharing require a particular kind of courage of leadership to have a vision for change along these lines. And let's face it, universities are very often scared of taking those stands, because we have to maintain this sort of air of neutrality, and also because we have a very limited understandings of how the assets of dialogue, of forming character, of intellectual rigor can be actually applied in a fair way across the spectrum. We also very much see this along partisan ways, and that has been a real failure and detriment.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ryan, for the question and for pushing us and reminding us that student affairs partners and staff and students are critical to this work as well. And in fact, our students and their activism over the years has been, I believe, what has helped us to push institutions to be better and to really examine those notions of harm that we continue to hear. Carla, I'm gonna unmute you. You'll probably be our last question before we wrap up. So you should be able to ask now.
Hi. My question has the University of Arizona discussed and started planning to address the need to better educate students coming in from outside of our community, to educate them on the community that they're joining as Arizona students in a meaningful and positive way, to improve that relationship between the incoming students and the people in our community, as well as to develop an appreciation for our community among those students?
Well, that's a great question. And you know what, that has been on the table. I know that our new Chief Officer for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, I know in SBS, when we have a very active group. One of the things that we started talking, for example, was the land acknowledgement. We have Professor Kelsey John working on this in SBS, College of Social Behavioral Science, about how do we create structures that make a live land acknowledgement practice. In other words, you have students who come to University of Arizona and don't know that there are 22 sovereign nations in this state. They don't understand the desert as an ecological, ethical responsibility of stewardship, the landscape itself. It took me a while when I was a student here to understand the darkness of our streets, and the fact that, there were some areas where you just don't use a lot of water, and desert landscaping is better. A lot of the incredible opportunities that happen for student engagement, I have seen it in the school garden program, the compost cats. Some of that gets translated when students get the opportunity to actually be able to then participate in clubs. Into some Meet Yourself a festival, we have several student clubs that are participating, Iranian students, Filipino students, Vietnamese students. They all get to participate of the fabric of the community. But I think in general, there is now an awareness that we have to do something in terms of orientation about the dynamics, not just of racial justice, but also the sense of place, that this is a community that you enter, and as you enter it, you are going to be, you're a guest in this desert land. The good thing, Carla, is that yes, I have heard conversations about these ideas bubbling up in different places in the institution, and a new awareness that is more than just a statement or a paper that says, oh, here's the land acknowledgement, here is what happens in Tucson, here's the demographic breakdown of a town that is just historically part of the of Mexico, of the Southwest, of the history of conquest, of the history of none of those things have been institutionalized in formal ways as part of an orientation, for example, but they are part of conversations, at least that I have heard of.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carla. Thank you all for your wonderful questions and keeping this conversation going. Dr. Alvarez, thank you for your time, for pushing us, especially on that last slide, to really think about how we as an institution, as a community, as faculty, staff, and students can continue to build institutional capacity around this notion of HSI serving us, but do it in a way that moves hopefully towards liberation for the communities with whom we partner and whose land we are on. And I just am so grateful for your knowledge today. And I had questions about funds of knowledge, and I wanted to hear about your own family and how you saw those moments and funds of knowledge coming into your current work. And that will have to be a conversation for another day for you and I, but
we'll do that cafecito.
Yes, for sure. Please, everyone, please help me thank our wonderful speaker, Dr. Maribel Alvarez. I will wait a moment so that we can get all these great comments in the chat. Thank you all for being here. And I know you're getting a big round of applause.
Thank you, Judy, and thanks everyone for joining us today.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone.